I had a contract with an ice-cold female CEO. I provided her with quality genes. She paid me 5 million yuan. Once the baby was born, we would be even, and I would disappear from her life forever. Simple. Clean. No strings attached. But what I never expected was that I turned out to be a little too talented. She ended up pregnant with twins. The day the babies were born, the entire hospital was in chaos outside the delivery room. Nurses were running around, doctors were shouting instructions, and bodyguards filled the hallway. And while everyone was distracted, I grabbed the younger twin, the one with the weaker cry, took the money, and ran. For 6 years, I hid away in the countryside. I raised chickens, grew vegetables, drove around in my beat-up three-wheeler. And honestly, life was peaceful. I raised my son just fine. Then one ordinary day, I drove into town with him to sell vegetables at the market. That was the day my peaceful life completely fell apart. A luxury car suddenly stopped right in front of my vegetable stand. The car door opened, and out stepped a little boy wearing a tiny black suit and bow tie. The moment I saw him, my blood froze, because he looked exactly like my son. Before I could even process what was happening, my son, Jaeminho, pointed at the little boy and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Dad, since when did you secretly have another kid in the city?" The entire vegetable market went silent. Every auntie and uncle nearby instantly turned to stare at me. I was finished. My mind went completely blank, and the cabbage I was holding nearly slipped from my hands. Cold sweat ran down my temple. In my wildest nightmares, I had never imagined that 6 years of peaceful country life would end like this. The little boy from the luxury car stared back at us with equal shock. But unlike my son, his expression carried something colder: scrutiny, curiosity, calculation. He looked exactly like a miniature CEO. Then the rear car door slowly opened again. First came a long leg wrapped in black stockings. Then came a face burned permanently into my memory. The face that still woke me up from nightmares after 6 years. Xin Bing. 6 years had passed, yet she hadn't changed at all. Her face was still as cold as ice. Her eyes still sharp enough to kill. The only difference was that, for the first time ever, a crack appeared in her perfectly emotionless expression. Her gaze moved slowly between the two boys. First, my son, dirty-faced, wearing patched jeans, running wild like a little country monkey. Then the other boy, dressed in a custom-tailored suit, neat and elegant like a tiny prince. Two identical faces. One raised in wealth. One raised in poverty. The entire world seemed to stop moving. Meanwhile, my heartbeat shot up to at least 180 beats per minute. "Dad," my son whispered nervously, "say something." Then, with absolutely zero awareness of the danger, he added, "Do you really have another family in the city? And what about me and Wang Dawa back home?" "Shut up." I instantly slapped my hand over his mouth before he could continue embarrassing me. Wang Dawa was literally just the village chief's dog. I forced out a smile uglier than crying and said awkwardly, "Haha, kids say the craziest things sometimes. Don't take him seriously." But Xin Bing completely ignored my explanation. Her cold gaze swept slowly across my body and my son's face like two razor-sharp scalpels dissecting us piece by piece. At the same time, the two men in black standing behind her quietly began walking toward us. Run. That was the only thought left in my head. Without hesitation, I slammed the throttle on my three-wheeler. The old vehicle, which had been with me for 6 years, immediately rattled like it was about to explode. Then it shot forward into the crowded market like a missile loaded with vegetables. Behind me, Xin Bing's icy voice rang out loud and clear. "Stop him. Don't let him escape, or you'll all be in serious trouble." Back in the day, I used to call myself the king of the road. And at that moment, survival instincts kicked in hard. I pushed the throttle all the way down. The three-wheeler tore through the narrow market aisles like a lunatic. I smashed into 2 fruit stands, flattened an entire mountain of tomatoes, and nearly sent an old auntie flying into a basket of watermelons. The entire market instantly exploded into chaos. My tomatoes! Are you blind? Somebody stop him! The shouting of the aunties and uncles echoed wildly behind me as my three-wheeler roared forward like a desperate escape vehicle. The shouting of the aunties and uncles blended together with the pounding footsteps of the bodyguards chasing behind us. Dad, this is awesome! It's like a movie! Jaminho screamed excitedly from the back of the three-wheeler, acting like we were on some amusement park ride instead of running for our lives. Awesome, my ass! I snapped. We're trying not to die here. But deep down, I already knew the truth. There was no way my beat-up three-wheeler could outrun luxury cars and professional bodyguards forever. The moment we burst out of the market, a black luxury sedan suddenly drifted sideways and blocked the road completely. My heart sank instantly. No escape. Before I could even react, 2 bodyguards grabbed me from both sides and yanked me off the vehicle like I weighed nothing. The next thing I knew, my face was slammed against the hood of the car, cheek pressed against the freezing cold paint. Meanwhile, another bodyguard scooped Jaminho into his arms. But instead of being scared, my son was grinning ear to ear and making funny faces at the little boy in the suit. The boy in the tiny suit simply stared back at him silently, looking completely stunned. Then I heard it. The sound of high heels clicking slowly against the pavement. One deliberate step after another. Shin Bing walked toward me calmly, her expression colder than winter itself. Jae-woo. She spoke my name softly. But somehow, that quiet voice made my entire body flinch harder than a scream. Long time no see. I forced my head up and immediately switched to my most charming smile. Miss Shin. What a coincidence. I laughed awkwardly. Here to buy vegetables too? The corner of Shin Bing's mouth twitched slightly. But she didn't answer. Instead, she crouched down slowly in front of Jaminho. Her cold eyes studied his face carefully while she reached out as if she wanted to touch his cheek. The moment he saw her hand coming closer, Jaminho instantly leaned backward suspiciously. Who are you? Then he narrowed his eyes seriously. And don't even think about becoming my stepmom. My dad already belongs to Wang Dawa. I told you already. I shouted in embarrassment. Wang Dawa is a dog. Shin Bing's hand froze midair. She slowly stood back up. Then her gaze returned to me. That look alone was enough to kill someone. 6 years ago, she said calmly, I gave birth to twins. My scalp immediately went numb. Correct. Her voice remained perfectly calm. But underneath that calm, I could feel a volcano about to erupt. At the same time, the bodyguards gripping my shoulders tightened their hold even harder. My brain spun wildly. If I admitted it, I was dead. If I denied it, I was probably still dead. So naturally, I chose the third option. Pretend to be innocent. My eyes darted around as I quickly forced the most shocked expression I could manage. Twins. Miss Shin, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. I immediately pointed toward Jaminho. This kid is my nephew. My brother and sister-in-law died in a car accident years ago, so I raised him myself. I even forced a couple fake tears into my eyes for extra effect. It hasn't been easy. Then I pointed proudly at Jaminho's face. Besides, look how much he resembles me. People always say nephews take after their uncles, right? Exactly. Before I could continue the performance, Jaminho suddenly frowned at me in confusion. Dad, what are you talking about? Since when do you even have a brother? Then he scratched his head innocently and added the finishing blow. Didn't Grandma and Grandpa die ages ago? I stared at my own son in absolute horror. At that moment, I genuinely wanted the ground to split open and swallow me whole. Shin Bing calmly pulled out a folder and tossed it toward me. This is Shin Jae's birth certificate. And these are the hospital records from 6 years ago. Her eyes locked onto mine without blinking once. The records clearly state that the male infant in incubator B disappeared exactly 3 hours after birth. My chest tightened instantly. Damn it. I had been so focused on escaping back then that I completely forgot to destroy the evidence. No. Stay calm. Maybe it was still just a coincidence. But Shin Bing was clearly done wasting time talking. She turned toward the bodyguards coldly. Take him back to Cloud Summit Estate. Then she added without hesitation. And contact our lawyer. I want a paternity test immediately. Yes, Miss Shin. And just like that, I was hauled into the back seat of the luxury car like a wanted criminal. Jaminho was tossed in beside me. But instead of panicking, he immediately started touching every part of the leather interior excitedly. Dad! He shouted happily. This car is way more comfortable than your three-wheeler. Then he paused thoughtfully. But your three-wheeler is definitely faster. What's the point of being fast? I groaned. They still caught us anyway. The convoy drove straight toward the richest district on the edge of the city, Cloud Summit Estate. Just hearing the name alone practically screamed money. A few minutes later, the car stopped in front of a massive villa that looked more like a castle than a house. Jaminho and I were escorted inside by the bodyguards. The living room alone was so huge it looked big enough to hold an entire basketball court. The giant crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling nearly blinded me. As for Jaminho, the moment he entered the mansion, his tiny brain completely exploded from excitement. Whoa! He immediately threw himself onto the soft carpet and rolled around like a happy puppy. I'm never leaving this place. Meanwhile, Shin Bing calmly sat down on the sofa at the head of the room like an empress preparing to judge criminals. And judging by the terrifying look in her eyes, I had a very bad feeling my peaceful life was officially over. The little boy named Shinji sat quietly beside her. He held a tablet in his hands, but his eyes kept drifting toward Jaminho, who was currently rolling around on the floor barking like a dog. Born from the same mother, yet the contrast between the two children couldn't have been more extreme. Finally, Shin Bing spoke. Jae-woo. Her voice was calm, cold, and completely emotionless. I'll give you one chance. She crossed her legs slowly. Pay back the 5 million yuan from 6 years ago. Then her eyes narrowed slightly. Leave the child here, and you're free to go. The moment those words left her mouth, my stomach dropped. That 5 million yuan had long since disappeared. It went into building a small house in the countryside, buying farmland, raising chickens, paying for food and daily living expenses over the last 6 years. There was barely anything left. But more importantly, she wanted me to leave Jaminho behind. How could I possibly agree to that? I turned to look at my son, who was still happily rolling across the carpet laughing without a single worry in the world. For 6 years, I had raised him with everything I had. I taught him to walk, fed him, protected him, stayed awake with him when he was sick. He was my son. Taking a deep breath, I finally looked Shin Bing directly in the eyes for the first time since we met again. Miss Shin, I can find a way to repay the money. Then my voice hardened. But Jaminho is my son. I will not give him to you. A faint smile suddenly appeared on Shin Bing's face, as if she had just heard the funniest joke imaginable. Your son. She leaned back slowly. Don't forget our contract. You were nothing more than a gene donor. I immediately straightened my neck stubbornly and shot back. The contract never said what would happen if there were twins. Then I pointed toward Jaminho. And when he was born, he was so weak the doctors said he might not survive. My fists tightened unconsciously. I was the one who carried him back to the countryside. I fed him rice porridge spoon by spoon. I stayed up all night using old home remedies to keep his fever down. I was the one who kept him alive. And that was the truth. Shinbing had delivered the babies early. Jaminho had been tiny and painfully thin when he was born. His cry was barely louder than a kitten's meow. Yes, I ran away partly because of the money. But another reason was because I genuinely feared this cold-hearted woman would never care about a weak child like him. For just a brief moment, something flickered across Shin Bing's face. A tiny crack in her icy expression. But it disappeared almost instantly. I don't care about the process, she said coldly. I care about results. Then her eyes locked onto mine sharply. And the result is that you stole my money. And stole my son. She slowly stood up. Towering over me, she said in a voice so cold it made my spine shiver. Neither of you is going anywhere until the DNA test results come back. Then she leaned slightly closer. Otherwise, I'll show you what real despair looks like. And just like that, my imprisonment officially began. On the very first day of being trapped inside this mansion, I got my first taste of what rich people called a boring life. Shin Bing had arranged a guest room for me and Jaminho. But calling it a guest room honestly felt insulting. The room alone was bigger than my entire house back in the countryside. It had a private bathroom or a walk-in closet or a massive king-sized bed, and even a terrace overlooking an entire golf course. Meanwhile, Jaminho was absolutely losing his mind from excitement. He bounced wildly across the giant bed while using the ridiculously expensive duvet like a trampoline. "Dad!" he shouted happily. "Are we living here from now on?" Then he grinned brightly. "If we are, this is amazing. This place is way bigger than old Wang's pigsty." I stared at him speechlessly. Could this kid please find a better comparison? Unfortunately, unlike him, I was nowhere near as excited. I quietly walked over and tested the bedroom door. Locked. It didn't even budge. Outside, two men in black stood motionless like stone statues guarding a prison cell. Even the windows had safety restrictors installed. They opened only a tiny crack. Shin Bing had literally locked me up like a criminal. Time passed slowly, minute by minute, second by second. Eventually, lunchtime arrived. A maid came upstairs and politely escorted us to the dining room. The moment I entered, I froze slightly. The massive dining table was covered with luxurious dishes from all over the world. Chinese food, Western food, Japanese cuisine, basically everything imaginable. Shin Bing sat calmly at the head of the table. Meanwhile, Shinji sat quietly to her left, carefully cutting his steak with perfect posture using a knife and fork. Jaminho and I were seated directly across from them. The moment my son saw the food, his eyes nearly exploded with excitement. He grabbed an entire Australian lobster with both hands and immediately tried stuffing it into his mouth hole. I nearly had a heart attack. "Put that down," I snapped immediately. "Gnawing on it with your bare hands is embarrassing." As I scolded him, I automatically picked up the proper utensils and started skillfully shelling the lobster for him myself. After removing all the meat carefully, I placed it neatly into his bowl. Jaminho instantly gave me a huge sweet smile. "Thank you, Dad." Then he picked up his fork, stabbed a piece of lobster meat. But instead of eating it himself, he lifted it toward my mouth. "Dad eats first." My heart melted instantly. This kid was honestly too considerate. Smiling helplessly, I leaned forward and ate the piece he offered me. Across the table, Shin Bing suddenly paused mid-motion. Her knife and fork froze in her hands. She silently watched the interaction between me and Jaminho with an unreadable expression. Beside her, even Shinji had stopped eating. He was staring at us quietly, as if he had never seen something like this before. Shinji sat silently, watching everything unfold. Finally, Shin Bing cleared her throat and broke the silence. Her tone left absolutely no room for argument. Jaminho, starting today, you will learn proper manners. No shouting at the table. No eating with your hands. And you will learn how to properly use a knife and fork. Understood. Jaminho looked up while chewing a mouthful of lobster and blinked innocently. What are manners? Then he tilted his head curiously. Can you eat them? Shinbing's eyebrow twitched instantly. Shinji, she said coldly. Show him. Shinji quietly put down his utensils, picked up a clean set, and handed them carefully to Jaminho. You hold them like this, he explained softly. Jaminho immediately tried copying him. But the moment he picked up the fork, clang! The fork flew straight onto the floor. Trying to retrieve it, Jaminho bent down too quickly and smashed his forehead directly into the table leg. Ow! He yelped loudly, and the entire dining room instantly exploded into chaos. The maids rushed over in panic. One brought tissues. Another brought ice. Meanwhile, I quietly watched the frantic scene unfold before glancing at Shinbing's increasingly dark expression. And honestly, I felt a tiny bit satisfied inside. Serves you right for looking down on country people. My son alone was enough to throw your entire luxury mansion into chaos. Eventually, after what felt like a battlefield rather than a meal, lunch somehow ended. Shinbing called Shinji over and handed him a huge pile of expensive-looking toys. Take your brother to the toy room. Then she turned toward Jaminho and added coldly, all of these are yours too. Take whatever you want. The moment I heard that, alarm bells instantly rang inside my head. This woman was trying to corrupt my innocent countryside son with money and luxury. Absolutely not. But before I could protest, the two identical boys finally stood side by side properly for the first time. Shinji was holding a transformer toy in his hands, looking slightly nervous and uncertain. Meanwhile, Jaminho circled around him curiously like a monkey inspecting a rare animal. Then suddenly, he reached out and started touching Shinji's clothes. Whoa! The fabric on your clothes is amazing. He rubbed the sleeve again in disbelief. It's way softer than my dad's undershirts. Shinji's face instantly turned red with embarrassment. It's silk, he answered quietly. Before Shinji could react, Jaminho suddenly grabbed his hand enthusiastically. I know somewhere super fun. Come on. Keep up. Without waiting for permission, Jaminho dragged Shinji all the way into the massive back garden of the estate. There stood an enormous old tree. Jaminho rolled up his sleeves confidently. Watch this. Then, like a tiny wild monkey, he spat into both palms, rubbed his hands together dramatically, and scrambled up the tree effortlessly. Within seconds, he was already sitting comfortably on one of the higher branches. Looking down proudly, he shouted, Come up here. The view is awesome. Below him, Shinji stared upward with wide eyes filled with both fear and longing. I've never climbed a tree before, he admitted softly. I don't know how. Jaminho immediately waved his hand dismissively. There's nothing to be scared of. I'll teach you. Then he pointed downward. Put your hands there. Now your feet here. That's it. Exactly like that. With Jaminho loudly cheering him on, Shinji actually started climbing. Awkwardly. Clumsily. But determined. Meanwhile, I leaned casually against the tree trunk and watched the two boys together. A strange, complicated feeling slowly rose inside my chest. Then suddenly, Shinbing's cold voice came from behind me. Jae-woo. I turned around. She stood there with her arms crossed, a faint trace of mockery on her face. What kind of future do you think this style of parenting will give him? Her eyes drifted toward the tree. Are you training him to raid bird nests for a living? Or hunt rabbits in the mountains? I smiled faintly and pointed toward the two boys in the tree. Miss Shin, I may never be able to give him $1 billion inheritance. But I can give him a happy childhood. I looked up at Jaminho proudly. I don't need him to become some incredible genius. As long as he grows up happy. That's enough for me. Then I glanced sideways at her. And look. Your son seems pretty happy right now too. He's probably never smiled like that before. Shin Bing subconsciously followed my gaze upward. With Jaminho helping him from above, Shinji had finally climbed onto one of the lower branches. His small hands still clung nervously to the trunk. But his face was glowing with excitement and happiness unlike anything she had probably ever seen before. The two boys sat side by side on the branch together. Jaminho pointed proudly into the distance while enthusiastically telling Shinji stories about his legendary rule over the countryside village. Something flickered quietly inside Shin Bing's eyes. For the first time all day, she fell silent. Then suddenly, crack. The branch beneath Shinji suddenly snapped loudly under the weight. Ah! Shinji screamed in terror as his body tilted sideways off the branch. He's falling. Shin Bing's face instantly turned deathly pale. Shinji! At the same moment, my heart shot straight into my throat. What kind of cheap weak tree was this? But before anyone else could react, Jaminho moved instantly. Like a little monkey, he lunged forward and wrapped both arms tightly around Shinji's waist. Don't be scared, he shouted. Hold on to me. Using every bit of strength in his tiny body, Jaminho desperately tried pulling Shinji back upward. But the broken branch had already lost balance. The momentum dragged both boys downward together. Fortunately, the branch wasn't very high, and beneath the tree was a thick layer of soft grass. The two boys landed hard in the thick grass, tumbling over each other in a tangled heap. Shin Bing and I rushed over at the exact same time. She immediately grabbed Shinji and pulled him tightly into her arms. Are you okay? Her usually cold voice was trembling slightly now. Did you get hurt when you fell? She checked him frantically from head to toe, her eyes already starting to turn red with panic. Meanwhile, I quickly helped Jaminho back onto his feet. The little guy rubbed his backside dramatically and groaned. Dad, my butt just split into 8 pieces. But before I could even respond, he immediately turned to look at Shinji with concern. Hey, little suit. You okay? Shinji was still shaking slightly from the scare, but he slowly nodded. Then, after hesitating for a moment, he quietly said to Jaminho, Thank you. If you hadn't grabbed me, I definitely would have fallen really hard. It was the very first time Shinji had spoken to Jaminho on his own initiative. Meanwhile, after confirming that Shinji had only scraped his elbow a little, Shin Bing finally let out a relieved breath. But almost immediately after calming down, she turned all of her anger toward me instead. Jae-woo. Her icy glare could practically freeze someone alive. So this is what you call a happy childhood? Letting him drag my son into something this dangerous? Her voice became sharper and sharper. If anything had happened to Shinji today, I would personally make sure you spent the rest of your life in prison. This woman was seriously impossible to reason with. I hadn't even opened my mouth yet before Jaminho suddenly stepped forward angrily. It has nothing to do with my dad. He puffed up his cheeks and frowned fiercely. I was the one who wanted him to climb the tree. Then he crossed his arms proudly. A real man doesn't cry over a little fall. Look at me. I fall down every day and I'm perfectly fine. He puffed out his tiny chest and planted himself protectively in front of me like a little rooster trying to defend its parent. Then he pointed proudly at Shinji. And besides, I saved him. So you should be thanking me. The moment she heard that, Shin Bing froze completely. For several seconds, she simply stared at this boy who looked exactly like her other son, but behaved like a tiny street gangster. For once in her life, she genuinely had no response. At that moment, even Shinji quietly spoke up. Mom. It's not his fault. I wanted to climb the tree myself. Shin Bing's expression changed repeatedly. Shock, frustration, disbelief. She had probably never experienced being betrayed by both sons at the same time before. Finally, she let out a cold snort, picked Shinji up into her arms, and walked back toward the villa without looking back once. After she left, I crouched down and ruffled Jaminho's messy hair proudly. That was pretty brave back there. You actually protected me. Jaminho immediately lifted his chin proudly. Of course. I'm your son. Being brave is my specialty. On the surface, it might have looked like I lost this round completely. But deep down, I knew I had quietly planted a seed in both boys' hearts. That evening, Shin Bing launched another attack. A financial attack. Several maids carried an entire mountain of toys into Jaminho's guest room. Remote control sports cars. Massive Lego castles. Limited edition action figures. The room practically looked like a toy store exploded. Shin Bing stood calmly in the doorway with her usual cold expression. All of these are for you. Then she added flatly, be good, and there will be even more. The moment I heard that, my instincts immediately screamed danger. Here it came. Classic capitalist corruption tactics. I nervously glanced toward my son. Jaminho excitedly dug through the mountain of toys for a long time. Then finally, he picked up the cheapest item in the entire pile. A tiny plastic water gun. His eyes sparkled as he looked at me hopefully. Dad, I like this one. Can I play with it? I instantly smiled and nodded. Of course. The next second, he started happily running around the room firing imaginary bullets at the ceiling. After a while, he got bored and suddenly ran back over to me. Dad, tell me a story. Tell me the one about how you chased the wild boar out of the village. I almost choked. I never chased any wild boar. The wild boar chased me for 3 kilometers. Still, I cleared my throat dramatically and began telling him a completely exaggerated and wildly fictional version of the story anyway. Jaminho listened with total fascination. Before long, he fell asleep right there in my arms while smiling softly. Carefully, I carried him over and tucked him gently into bed. When I turned around afterward, I realized Shin Bing was still standing silently in the doorway. Her eyes slowly moved across the expensive toys Jaminho had abandoned without caring about them at all. Then her gaze settled on the sleeping boy in my arms. This time, there was a strange depth in her expression that I couldn't understand. I quietly walked over toward her and lowered my voice. Miss Shin, you see now. There are some things money can't buy. Then I glanced toward the sleeping child. Like a father's love. I deliberately puffed out my chest slightly, trying to recover at least a little dignity after being bullied by her all day. So maybe. Stop trying to buy us with money all the time. For a very long time, Shin Bing remained silent. Honestly, I thought she was about to call the bodyguards and throw me out of the villa immediately. But instead, she simply said calmly, tomorrow, the paternity test samples will be sent for analysis. Then her cold eyes met mine directly. You better pray that he doesn't turn out to be my son. After saying that, she turned around and walked away. Watching her lonely figure slowly disappear down the hallway, the tiny sense of victory I had just felt quietly vanished too. My little moment of sympathy for Shin Bing disappeared almost instantly. Because 3 seconds later, reality hit me hard again. Jaminho was 100% her son. The moment those DNA test results came back, I was dead. I couldn't just sit around waiting for my execution. I had to do something. Early the next morning, the family doctor arrived carrying an entire case of medical equipment. Jaminho, Shinji, and I sat in a row on the sofa, waiting to have our blood drawn. Shinji was clearly used to procedures like this. He calmly rolled up his sleeve without the slightest hint of fear. Meanwhile, Jaminho looked like he was about to be publicly executed. The second he saw the needle, His tiny face turned ghostly white. He immediately wrapped himself around my neck like a koala. Dad, I don't want a shot. Needles kill people. I don't wanna die. I quickly patted his back and comforted him. Relax. Don't be scared. It feels exactly like a mosquito bite. It barely hurts at all. Jaminho looked at me suspiciously. Really? Really? While I comforted him on the surface, my brain was racing like crazy underneath. I had to find a way to tamper with the samples. My eyes quietly drifted toward the collection tubes on the table. The doctor drew blood from Shinji first and neatly labeled his sample tube. Then it was Jaminho's turn. The moment the needle came near him, he exploded into hysterics. No needles. No needles. He twisted and squirmed wildly in my arms like a fish caught in a net. The doctor panicked. The maids rushed over. Everyone crowded around, trying to hold him still. And just like that, the room descended into total chaos. My opportunity had arrived. While everyone's attention was focused entirely on Jaminho, I quietly dragged my fingernail hard across my own arm beneath my sleeve. Damn, that actually hurt. The moment the doctor inserted the needle into Jaminho's arm, I leaned forward pretending to comfort him. At the same time, I secretly slid my injured hand beneath his arm. One tiny drop of my blood silently fell into the sample tube labeled with Jaminho's name. Mission accomplished. Afterward, I quietly let out a long breath of relief. As long as the test results showed that Jaminho and Shin Bing weren't biologically related, then she would have no reason to keep us trapped here anymore. Honestly, I was impressed with myself. I was basically a genius. Unfortunately, my happiness lasted less than 10 seconds. Because immediately afterward, the doctor calmly announced, "We'll also take cheek swab samples from all three of you." He adjusted his glasses casually, just for a double confirmation. My smile instantly froze. Double check. My stomach dropped straight to hell. I stared at the sealed sample bags in horror. At that moment, they no longer looked like medical samples. They looked like my personal death warrants. That afternoon, Shin Bing had to leave for an important company meeting. Before leaving, she specifically called Jaminho and me downstairs. Shinji's piano teacher will be arriving today for his lesson. Then she looked directly at Jaminho. Behave yourself. Do not disturb them. Finally, her cold eyes landed on me. And if you can't control him, I'll do it for you. Yep, that was definitely a threat. Unfortunately for her, I wasn't easy to scare. After Shin Bing left, a middle-aged man walked into the villa wearing a fancy tailcoat with his hair slicked back so aggressively it looked like it had been shellacked. Apparently, he was Shinji's piano teacher. Some internationally famous piano master or something equally annoying. The man sat gracefully in front of a giant grand piano that probably cost more than my entire village. Meanwhile, Shinji obediently sat beside him. Soon, elegant piano music filled the room. Jaminho slowly crept closer with wide eyes full of amazement. He leaned against the piano and whispered in complete shock. Whoa! This thing sings by itself? The piano master frowned slightly at the interruption, but maintained his composure and ignored him. When the performance ended, the teacher began correcting Shinji's technique. Wrong. His voice was sharp and cold. This section should sound powerful and passionate. Not weak and lifeless like whatever that was. He slapped the edge of the piano impatiently. Wrists up. How many times do I have to repeat myself? Then his face twisted in irritation. Are you a pig? You can't even memorize something this simple? The more he spoke, the nastier his attitude became. His voice grew louder and louder until he was basically insulting the child openly. Shinji sat there silently with his head lowered. His ears turned red. His eyes filled with tears. But he stubbornly refused to let them fall. Just watching the scene made my blood boil. What kind of teacher was this? Was he educating a child, or training a dog? Apparently, Jaminho had reached his limit too. Suddenly, he stormed over to the piano and slammed both hands onto the keys. Bang! The violent crash startled everyone in the room. Jaminho pointed furiously at the teacher and shouted, "Don't talk to him like that. You're the pig. Your whole family are pigs." The piano teacher's face instantly turned purple with rage. "You rude little brat," he shouted while jumping to his feet. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Jaminho immediately planted both hands on his hips fearlessly. "I don't care who you are." Then he pointed threateningly at the grand piano. "If you say one more mean thing to him, I'll pee on your piano." I quickly lowered my head to hide my smile. My son truly did not play around. The piano master was practically trembling from anger at this point. He pointed at me furiously. This is the son you raised.